Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome back to another World of Tanks review. This time we're looking at the Tier 8 American turreted tank destroyer, the T28 Prototype. Now I usually start off these reviews with just a little bit of history, a bit of background for you, but honestly I've tried looking for information about this machine, but I can't really tell you anything more than we've got in the garage here. An early prototype of a heavy tank designed to break through the fortifications of the German Siegfried line, existed only in blueprints, blah 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 blah. Now, presumably from the designation T28 Prototype, it was part of the T28 heavy tank program, which was a thing, but there is no reference, at least that I was able to find in a very quick perusal, of any machine in that development having a turret. So I'm kind of thinking, whoops, that's Christmas, kind of thinking this might be a little bit of an elaboration on Wargaming's part, but I don't know for sure. So I can't really give you anything more historical about this machine, I'm afraid. However, we will have a look at its characteristics. And throughout the course of this this video, I am going to be making comparisons with some of the other Tier 8 tank destroyers, notably the T28 as its non-turreted counterpart, the Rheinmetall Scorpion G as a turreted premium German tank destroyer, and the Charioteer as a turreted regular British tank destroyer, because I think they're the most obvious and the closest comparisons. Anyway, before we get any farther, let's just have a quick look at the grind on this thing that you are going to be faced with, because I think this is something that is worth noting. So let's have a look at the different modules. Start off with the engine. This engine is used on the prototype here, the T95 and the regular T28. This means that if you have not gone down the other American tank destroyer line first, you are going to be having the stock engine with 670 horsepower rather than the 780 that the fully upgraded engine gets. So it means you're going to want at some point to unlock the engine. Doesn't take a huge amount of effort and shouldn't be your priority. The radio, I mean, who cares, but you can have unlocked it on the M7 Priest, the T37, the Chaffee. You may well have this already unlocked. It's the guns that I really want to bring attention to. The T25/2 at Tier 7, one of the things that's a bit disappointing about it is that it's a Tier 7 tank destroyer with a 90mm gun, which is a little on the weedy side. What that means is that this 105mm gun you won't already have unlocked. You'll be stuck with the stock 90mm gun, unless you have already played down the other American tank destroyer line where you unlock this 105mm gun at Tier 7. So when I've been playing through, what I did was I unlocked this gun on the Tier 7 first before playing the T28 Prototype. Having this gun, while it doesn't make the prototype a fantastic tank, it at least makes it playable. This stock gun is pretty horrible to use for what is, as we're going to get onto in a minute, such a sluggish machine. The top gun, however, it will take you a bit of experience to unlock. How much is it? It's another 51,000 on top of the 18,000 from the 105 already. So it takes a while to unlock, but personally, I didn't burn free XP on this. I unlocked it the conventional way because I didn't find the grind, with that 105mm gun at least, I didn't find the grind that bad. And this gun is fairly decent. So I just wanted to mention that before we get any further. So, what do you get with this tank then? Well, I'm going to mention the firepower in just a minute, because that's when we're talking about the guns. In terms of survivability, it's sort of a good news, bad news situation. Worth noting, as you may have picked up earlier on, this is the Tier 8 American turreted tank destroyer. You can see the turret here. So, 1150 hit points isn't that impressive, but it's about par for the course for a Tier 8 TD. Lots of them have around about 1,000 to 1,200 hit points. It's not that unusual. I think the SU-101 is the lowest at 990. But it doesn't stack up to things like the IS-3 with 1,500. Heck, even the T-28 has 1,500 now. So the hit points are a little on the low side. In terms of hull and turret armor, well, on the turret it's 101 at the rear, 127 at the sides, and 203 at the front, which sounds very good. Hull, 50 at the rear, ouch. 50 on the sides, ouch, and that's a big profile, and 203 on the front. Now, do bear in mind, whilst that is not a lie, it is 203mm thick in most parts, as we're going to find out when we have a look at the armour profile in detail. I mean, you can already see it, the armour isn't that well sloped. This means that you should not be surprised if guns with 210 to 20 millimeters of penetration and upwards are able to go through your front without too much difficulty unless you do some angling. Yeah, that just shouldn't come as a massive surprise to you. It's just something to be aware of, but the armor on this thing is not bad. We'll get onto it more later on. Mobility is a bit of a problem. Now, this thing isn't as sluggish as it once was, but it is a 67-ton tank. It doesn't really look it, does it? But it is a 67-ton tank with a 780 horsepower engine, giving it a rather underwhelming specific power of less than 12 horsepower per ton. Combine that with a rather underwhelming top speed limit of 28 kilometers an hour forwards and 10 backwards, and a traverse speed of 21 degrees a second, and you get the impression that this is a rather sluggish tank, and that's because it is a rather sluggish tank. Let's not make any bones about it. That's just a thing you have to deal with. Speed is this tank's weakness. What about concealment? It is a tank destroyer at the end of the day. Yes, it is. But these are not the best concealment values of a tank destroyer ever, and as you're going to see when we get into some gameplay, it doesn't matter too much because that's not really how you play this tank anyway. View range, as I've got my machine kitted out, I have a 440 meter view range. That is a 390 meter base view range, plus 9 meters from the improved ventilation, 11 meters from situational awareness at the moment, and 40 meters from coated optics, giving me 440. You can get your view range up to a very respectable level with the T28 prototype, and I would definitely recommend doing that. Now let's have a talk about the firepower on this thing. So, if you have a look under the firepower option, I've got the Top Gun equipped here. Some things to note. We're going to talk about the exact gun stats in just a moment, but before we do, turret traverse speed 19.2 degrees per second, which isn't that impressive. Turret traverse angles 143 and 143. Now that seems a bit weird because usually those values are quoted for tank destroyers with a limited firing arc, but we said this thing has a turret. It does, but it's technically not a fully traversable turret. The gun, or the turret, can rotate through the front and sides of the tank, but it can't actually point over the rear, over this engine deck, which is why you have 143 degrees round the left and 143 degrees round to the right. So that's something worth bearing in mind. You can't point this gun over the back of the tank. 2. It says here you have 15 degrees of gun elevation, which isn't amazing, and 10 degrees of gun depression, which is very good, and it is. However, notice where the gun is, and you've got some hull poking out over the front. You get 10 degrees of gun depression over the sides. Remember those weak 50mm thick sides? Over the front you only get 6 degrees of gun depression, so that is worth bearing in mind. That the gun depression values, well, you have to be a little bit careful with them. Anyway, let's have a look at these guns. I'll show you all three just so you get an idea of why you don't want to use the stock gun. Stock gun, rate of fire of 8 rounds a minute. Woohoo! 90mm gun, 170 pen. We don't really need to look much further. 170 pen on a tier 8 tank, that is slow. That would be bad penetration for a tier 8 light tank, or a tier 8 medium tank, let alone a slow tier 8 machine. Especially when you bear in mind with the new matchmaker and whatnot, you are going to find yourself in a number of tier 10 battles. So if you do grind with the stock gun, you're probably going to find yourself having terrible games or loading some APCR. The mid gun, which is basically the gun from the T29, just a tank destroyer version of that gun. Accuracy, blech. Aim time is good. Rate of fire, 7.23 rounds a minute, 198 pen, 320 alpha. It's a bit more like it. This, as I say, this gun is fine for grinding with, though you do want to use the top gun when you have it unlocked. And that top gun, well, this is essentially the same gun that you get on the T34, but it's a better version of that gun. It's a 120mm gun, worth pointing out right now. When it comes to overmatch mechanics, they work on over triple the a gun caliber, sorry, that is over triple the thickness of the armour in question, not exactly triple the thickness. There are a number of, especially on German tanks, 40mm armour plates that you can overmatch with a gun that is 121mm, not 120. 5.94 rate of fire, which is actually pretty decent when you bear in mind the other stats on the gun. 248 penetration, now we're talking. Very nice. That goes up to just shy of 300 if you want to fire some APCR. I carry 3 APCR rounds on this tank, don't think I've ever fired a single one. 400 alpha damage is very nice, and when you combine it with the 5.94 rounds a minute rate of fire, you get a very healthy DPM on this machine indeed. 2.1 second aim time is decent, and a 0.38 dispersion at 100 meters. That's probably the single biggest weak point on this tank, 0.38 dispersion. Now I should point out, this gun doesn't look that impressive for a tank destroyer gun, but the playstyle of this machine is much more like a heavy tank that trades away some of its hit points in order to get a better gun. If you compare this thing to the IS-3, for example, and you were to compare this gun to the 122mm on the IS-3, the T28's gun fires faster, has higher penetration, slightly higher alpha damage, better accuracy and a better aim time. It is better in every single respect. I know the dispersion values or the bloom values on the IS-3 are very good. I'm not going to get into all the soft stats. I'm just trying to demonstrate that if you compare this gun to Tier 8 heavy tank guns, the gun really does start shining, and that is how you play this tank. This is not a sniper. This is a tank that drives up to you and beats you in the face with its gun. Speaking of which, let's just have a quick look at things like crew skills, ammo capacity, equipment, and also I'm going to compare it to some other tanks in the game. So crew skill wise, on this tank you really want to prioritise repairs. You don't want to be going with that camouflage nonsense. Sixth sense on your commander is still a good skill to take, and then you probably want to be picking up other things, standard things like snapshot, smooth ride, all the good stuff. I've got safe stowage on my loader to try and minimise the number of ammo racks, and I have situational awareness on my radio operator because everybody likes view range. Worth pointing out, the rear of this tank is made of engine and fuel tank, perhaps not a huge surprise. The ammo rack locations are in the rear of the turret here, and also in the hulls, in the sides, just below the turret. So you can get ammo racked if you get caught in the sides. Basically, a T28 does not like it when people shoot its big fat side. That's just bad. Very, very bad. Equipment, I've got a gun rammer, optics, and improved vents. Is there anything else you might want to go with? I don't really think so, to be honest. I do think that's the best equipment loadout for this tank. Ammunition, I have mostly AP, a few rounds of high explosive, 120mm HE can be situationally very useful, and 3 rounds of APCR. I never had to fire a single round of it. You have basically 250 pen anyway on a tier 8 machine that doesn't tend to do much sniping, so yeah, that's pretty good. Standard 3 consumables, you could obviously swap those out for the large versions, or I guess if you really wanted you could pack some cola or something like that, but I just use your standard 3 small regular consumables there. Let's have a quick look at how it stacks up with some other tanks then. So here we've got the T28 Prototype on the left, the T28 next along, the Scorpion G. Let me just check I haven't done anything stupid. Yes, I have done stupid things with the Scorpion G. I'm just making sure that this is a perfectly fair and even comparison. So let's take the gun rammer off the Scorpion G, and we'll quickly check the Charioteer. We want to make sure we're using the top configuration on the Charioteer. There we go, and that should be fine. So this should be a fair and reasonable comparison then. And when we do that, well, we can just see some interesting things. Basically, all the tanks have the same alpha damage apart from the Scorpion, which is higher at 490. I mean, I'm not going to worry about the difference between 390 and 400 alpha. The Charioteer gets a higher base penetration, but bear in mind the Charioteer does not have access to a higher penetration premium round. Its premium round is Hesh. Rate of fire 6.2, 6.88. You can clearly see that the Americans kind of lead the field in this regard, although the Scorpion's lower rate of fire is obviously offset by that higher alpha damage. Reload time is the best on the T28 non-prototype version, so essentially if you compare the prototype and the regular T28, the regular T28 gets a higher rate of fire with the same gun. We've already talked about those values. Gun depression values, we mentioned the 10 degrees for the prototype is only over the sides. With the T28, that -5 is obviously over the front, but it's only -5. With the Scorpion, that's 7. With the Charioteer, it is 10, and that is all round, as that tank was fairly recently buffed. And in this comparison, they all have turrets of some sort or another, apart from the T28. Aiming time, well, the Charioteer just falls behind, but nothing particularly noteworthy about the American machines here. Where they do fall off a bit is with regard to accuracy. The German tank is the most accurate, then the British, and the Americans just being the least accurate. The T28 Prototype has, well, I mean, if you look at the DPM actually, you'll notice that the only tank in this comparison that really beats the others hands down is the non-turreted machine, the regular T28. So you're trading away that turret in order to get about an extra, just shy of 300 DPM to go with it. The armour on the front of the T28 is clearly the most formidable. Having said that, because you have a turret on the Prototype, you can angle that armour a bit more. And the other two tanks don't really have any armour to speak of. Both of these just get penetrated by high explosive rounds all over the shop. The American machines do fall behind when it comes to mobility. We did mention that was a problem of these tanks anyway. And when it comes to things like spotting and whatnot, in terms of base spotting value, the T28 Prototype does come out ahead with its base view range of 380, which beats both the T28 and the Charioteer at 370. So essentially, if you try and compare this tank to its peers, what you're getting is a tank with more armour than either the German or the British machine, but in order to get that armour, it does trade away some of the characteristics on the gun. It's one way of looking at it. Or if you compare it to the regular T28, it gains a turret, but in exchange loses just shy of 300 DPM. Nothing too catastrophic, but just worth being aware of there, I believe. So, having waffled on for long enough about this tank in the garage, let's have a look at the armour profile and then jump into a little bit of gameplay. So, let's have a quick look at that armour profile on the Prototype. As advertised, the rear is basically 51mm thick, the side is 51mm thick. You do not want to be showing the rear or the side of your hull to anyone. The engine deck is a paltry 25mm thick. Artillery will have a field day if they hit you there. Turret, well, the turret roof is it's a very unimpressive 38mm thick, though that's better than the engine deck, I guess. The rear of the turret, 101mm thick. You're only really going to bounce the odd, maybe light tank that takes you from behind. Side of the turret, 127, but your effective armour is often 130 plus. So you can actually find might get the occasional bounce from the side of your turret, especially if a tank with a low caliber gun is shooting at you. But really, the armour of this tank is on the front, so let's talk about it. On the hull, your lower plate is 152mm thick. However, it is angled back at such an amusing angle that is effectively like 290mm thick or something. Long story short, unless the Prototype is cresting over a ridge like this towards you, you do not shoot it in the lower front plate. That ain't gonna pen. This frontal plate is 203mm thick with a little bit of angling to make it effectively around the 215-ish mark. This is a weak point, this machine gun port. Let's just switch back to the live model. Sorry, not the live model, I'm such an idiot. The visual model. And hopefully you should be able to see that there's that machine gun port. This is a weak point on the front of the tank. This is a tank with weak points, guys. I know, it's weird, but there we go. So weak point here. You still need about 150 plus millimeters of penetration to go through it, but hey, a weak point is a weak point. These shoulder sections, if you were thinking of trying to shoot there, don't. It's 147 millimeters of armor, angled back at almost 68 degrees. If you have a look at the slope on those, yeah, you get the idea. Those things are a big fat can of nope. This section, you may be looking at it going, oh, that looks like a weak spot. Well, once again, it's another one of those. It's only 127 millimeters, angled back at 67 degrees, meaning that you could bounce tier 10 premium rounds on that section of armor. Not guaranteed to bounce, but you could bounce. So the hull is pretty decent. If you are able to angle your tank, and let's say you're able to hide this section of your tank with a building or something, then you can start getting armor values up to around the 250 to 260 mark, depending on how much angle you're able to put on it. Turret time then. These cheek sections are, well, it's sort of a good news, bad news situation. Right at the extremes of the turret sides, as you look at it from the front, you're only 140 odd millimeters thick, but an extreme angle, 350 effective. But this flattens out as you get closer and closer to the front of the tank. And by the time you're here, which is kind of just off the cheeks, you're actually looking at effective armor values of around about 210, 220. By the time you get here, which are the turret cheeks themselves, angle is so flat that you're looking at about 210-ish millimeters. So a lot of tier 8 heavy tanks have around about the 220 mark for penetration. If you're looking at that and a T28 prototype is looking straight at you, you've got a decent chance of being able to go straight through the turret cheeks. In terms of these commander's hatches, well, are they weak? Yes and no. Again, you're looking at about 210 to 220 millimeters of effective thickness. So, from the front, the weakest point on the armor really is this machine gun port. If you can't hit that, you're looking at needing about 210, 220 millimeters of penetration and upwards to go through the front of this tank. So the armor is pretty decent, and you can, of course, accentuate that with some angling. That's quite enough of me babbling along like an idiot, so let's have a look at gameplay. To start things off then, we are looking at a tier 8 match. This is 357 matchmaking, 3 tier 8s on either team, and we find ourselves here on Pac-Man Grad. Isn't it the greatest map in the world? Booyah. Anyway, for the T28 prototype, actually, this is a pretty decent map. Generally speaking, you can hide from enemy artillery, and there's only one artillery on the enemy team anyway, so there's that. And you can basically play a nice heavy tank role, which effectively, as I mentioned in the garage, you are. So, let's see what we can do. We're initially going over to the left-hand side. T28, Type 64, T29, IS-6, AT-15A and T-150 all appear to be going this way as well. What we really want to do, we don't really want to come across the Rheinmetall Borsig or the Scorpion if we can possibly avoid it, or the Su-152. They have guns that can reasonably threaten the front of our tank. Machines such as the T32, however, yeah, we will take him on any day of the week. T34-100, definitely. Jagdpanther, yup. And the list goes on. So, we've identified the tanks that we really want to avoid. The Rheinmetall Borsig, Scorpion, and the Su-152. Basically the tank destroyers, because they're the ones that are most likely to have guns that can go through us. Now, we saw the Su-152 there. It looked like, ooh, yay, assistance damage. It looked like he might be using the 122mm gun. If he is, ooh, 430, yes, thank you. And if he is using the 122s, that's good news for us, because those things are really lacking in penetration, although it doesn't really matter anymore because the guy has gone up to the Spirit in the Sky. So far, ooh, hello, T34-85. Oh, jeez, man, jeez. Ooh, we rolled for 466. It doesn't feel fair shooting a tier 6 with 400 alpha. 466, set him on fire for 105. He clearly has a fire extinguisher, not a premium one, a regular one, and he was able to stop the fire in its tracks. Now, KV-85, if you're an idiot, you're going to try and pull out. A bit like that, really. There's another nice meaty shot into him. A low damage roll that time, 386 at tier 8. When you can say that's a low damage roll, you're doing alright. And you can see here our reload time is of the order of around about 8.5 seconds, which for tier 8 is fine for 400 alpha damage. That's considerably better than you get on, hello Mr. T32, than you get on either the IS-3 or the T-34 or any of those tanks like that with roughly comparable alpha damage. Slight angle on the front of our tank there. The T-32 is only able to take out our tracks, and we're just buttering the front of this guy's hull. He tracks me again, but that is not enough angle on the front of your Tinky Tonk, Mr. T-32, and you are dead. And we're just going to plough on forwards, and this is what the T-28 does. It's a very satisfying machine to play when it's in its element. KV85 is strictly speaking still alive, although I wouldn't hold out too much hope for him. And this is going to be a pretty quick game, I'll be honest with you. Oh, we're a bit slow on the uptake for that VK there. That's a shame. That could have been another nice juicy 400 damage into him. So far we haven't actually picked up any kills, which is a little bit of a shame, but we're going to see what we can do about this VK. It would be really nice if we could pick up some damage on this guy, a bit like that. 373, and that takes us over the 3,000 damage mark. And the VK has got himself into a whole load of trouble, but the T29 puts him out of his misery, and unfortunately we can't really get through here. Now this is where the lack of mobility on the T28 prototype, even on a map like Pac-Man-Grad, is going to be problematic. We're going along at 27-28 kilometers an hour, but that's just not fast enough to keep up with tanks like an IS-6. In and of itself, it's not the fastest machine in the world, but it means that our friendly tanks are just going to get there first and farm all of that tasty damage at the end before we get there. Just speeding up this replay, because watching a T28 prototype trying to get into the fight is a pretty boring experience, and as you can actually see there, we're not able to get back in the fight before the match ends. A little bit of a shame, but not the end of the world. So, nice quick game just to start things off there. Bit of a ruffle stomp at tier 8. Okay, so that game as top tier was only enough for 3rd class mastery. 5 for effect though, and a high caliber medal. Usually you don't get 3rd class and high caliber together, especially when most of your engagements are not at too great a range. Then again, I guess we did spend quite a lot of our time shooting tier 6 and 7 tanks. 3004 damage done, 840 base experience, no kills, alas, but we did come at the top of our team by experience or damage fairly easily. 10 shots fired, 7 hits, 7 pens for that damage count. 430 damage done from more than 300 meters, the rest from pretty close range. 4 hits received, none of them penetrated. So over 1,000 damage blocked by our armor, which is almost as much as we have hit points. 1 enemy vehicle spotted, 5 damaged, none destroyed, and a bit of assistance damage thrown into the bargain. With the standard account, we ended up making a profit of, well, basically 19,000 credits. Your shells are around about 1,000 credits each, which, with the relative inaccuracy of this gun, can make it not the cheapest tank in the world to run, though 1,000 credits for 400 alpha damage isn't too bad in the grand scheme of things. So that was our tier 8 match. Let's see how tier 10 fares. Here we go then, it's a tier 10 match. 357 again, though of course we are one of the 7 this time as opposed to one of the 3. Immediately the map, well, okay, so we're assaulting the Siegfried line. Appropriately enough, given that this tank was presumably part of the T28 program, which was specifically designed to assault the Siegfried line, so a little bit of serendipity there. But aside from that, tier 10 match. We first have to drive over to somewhere where we can start doing something, and this is where our mobility can be a problem. Thankfully the enemy team don't have any artillery. If they did, what you often find happen is a light tank drives out, spots you all, and if an artillery is paying attention, they drop a bomb on your face. Step 1 complete, the light tanks have come out, spotted us, but the enemy team lacks any artillery to bomb us into oblivion, so hurrah, I guess. Driving over here, trying to see if we can get ourselves into the action nice and quick, because, well, we don't have the time to faff around too much. Actually deciding there's quite a lot of tanks there already, so we're going to take a slightly longer route in order to try and be useful. And identifying the enemy tanks or the enemy tanks that are a threat, which is of course most of them. Batchat 12T, if he gets behind us, well, that's going to be problematic. Udez, Borsig, both have the penetration to go right through the front of us most of the time. T54 Mod 1, we should be able to nom. VK should also be eminently nommable. Oh, good lord, there's a mouse. VK 101p, he could be problematic, although with a little bit of angling, yeah, we should be able to take him. Obviously the tanks that are really a threat are the tier 9s and tier 10s, and we've already encountered one of them as the mouse is over yonder, which is something we do have to be aware of. So, we've got a Panzer 7 here pushing up. He's taken a shot from someone. Our E5 is also pushing up. So we're going to try and give these guys some fire support, trying to find the lower front plate of that mouse. But our shot doesn't quite hit. As I said, accuracy on this gun is not its strong stat. I mean, it's most American tanks typically have pretty mediocre accuracy. Their aim times and alpha damage and things like that tend to be pretty nice, and DPM, but fully aimed accuracy not so much, although we are able to put that shot into the side of the turret of the Batchat there. Now if you're paying attention to the scoreline, slightly problematically, it is 2-5. We have already lost one of our tier 10s, 2 of our tier 9s and 2 of our tier 8s, and we have in return managed to claim VK 101P and a Batchat 12T. We might manage to pick up this T54 into the bargain, but that doesn't change the fact that not only are we down... Ooh, we actually pick up the kill. Not only are we down on tanks, we are also down on tank tier, which is a bit of a problem. Losing a T110E5 is more problematic than losing a T54 Mod 1, for example, just by virtue of the former being 2 tiers higher. Now, we're not going to play this too aggressively. We're coming in to do some damage, and Lerva, he puts one into us. He is firing APCR, like the genius that he is, which means he's packing about 300 penetration with that 105mm gun. Where did he actually hit us, out of curiosity? Straight through the frontal plate. I think with armor-piercing rounds it probably would have been a 50-50 chance, or maybe a 40-60 as to whether he'd have gone through or not, but we're never really going to get the frontal plate up to the 300mm of effective armor that we need to bounce him. So we've had to use some of our hit points there. And I mentioned in the garage, this tank doesn't get a huge hit point pool, and that is the one thing in tier 10 games that can hurt you. The armor becomes much less useful, though not completely useless, just much less useful, and the hit point pool does not go very far. So we put a shot in there that appears to just damage that light tank's tracks. The mouse is now fired. We're coming in to try and deal with him along with our Panzer 7. So we're just going to try and whack some additional shots in here. And this is back when the mouse was Super Mouse. 3,200 hit points, a buffed gun, all of the upgrades. But we're just seeing what we can do. And I lie, I did actually load a single APCR round. I do apologise. There we go, there's my one APCR round. I loaded it purely to try and deal with that mouse, because I didn't want to faff around with his lower plate being at a funky angle. We were behind in tanks anyway. I wanted to push forward and help my teammates out. Speaking of which, goodbye Mr. T54 Lightweight. So, we are now on very, very little health. That VK4502A and the Waffenträger both took off large chunks of my hit points. We put another shot there into the VK this time, and oh dear, there's a rectal Borsig, and I reversed. I presumably didn't notice it at the time, which is a little bit unfortunate, and we get taken out, which is a shame. Had that Borsig not been there, or had I noticed sooner and had I moved forwards, we might have been able to make something of that. As it is what it is. So, Object 140 nails are 5100. Our Panzer 7 takes out their Waffenträger, but flubs against the enemy Borsig. Now, the Borsig is going to struggle to penetrate this guy from pretty much any angle other than rear or flush sides, even if he fires premium ammunition. Then again, he appeared to be managing to do that right up until he fudged it up. This Panzer 7 looks like he may not be too long for this world, unfortunately. And at this point I decide to exit the game because I think it's going to go disastrously wrong and I have no interest in watching the game any further. That all said and done, however, let's actually see how it went in the post-battle stats, and perhaps more importantly, given this is a tank review, how did the T28 Prototype perform? As it turned out then, despite my pessimism at the time, our team were actually able to pull a win out of the bag for that game, and the T28 Prototype actually did pretty well for itself in a tier 10 match, managing to achieve 5 for effect Bruiser, and First Class Mastery. We finished second on our team. And if we actually look at how each team did, the game was essentially carried by our Panzer VII, who did 7,500 damage and got 5 kills. Despite the fact that it looked like he was going to die there at the end, he presumably managed to survive and prod enough buttock to carry our team over the lines. The Stilitzwang also had a reasonable game, and the 3 of us were the top 3 performing tanks on our team by experience. We managed 2,560 damage, got 3 kills, 1,127 base experience, which is very nice, bearing in mind we were shooting higher tier tanks a reasonable amount of the time. Commiserations to the enemy Object 140 and the enemy Borsig and Lerva and VK, I guess, as they all achieved fairly respectable damage results for their tiers of tank. 13 shots fired, 10 hits, 8 penetrations for that damage count. 5 hits received, 4 penetrated, 1 did not. It was only the T32 that bounced on us. Because we fired a single round of APCR that match, I was mistaken, of course. I did dip into APCR a little bit to finish off that mouse for 1 shot, but because we did fire an APCR round, we actually made a small loss in credits on that game. With a premium account, it would have been a 10,500 credit profit, but with the standard account that we were running, we made a loss of about 2,000 credits. Still, a very nice amount of experience, though, for such a short game, as we died in under 5 minutes, but were still able to rack up 2,500 damage in a tier 10 match. So, let's jump back to the garage and just polish things off. Overall then, what do I think about the T28 Prototype? I actually think it's a pretty good machine. Now, this tank doesn't have the best reputation in the world. A lot of people find the poor mobility to be a real killer, but Wargaming did buff the speed limits on this tank a little while ago, and so it's not as sluggish as it once was. And if you can deal with the not great mobility, I mean, it's not Togmo levels of mobility, that thing is pretty much stationary, but if you can deal with the lackluster mobility, the package that you get actually has quite a nice combination of gun performance and armour, and if you're willing to be a little bit aggressive with it, it's actually quite a nice combination to use. You can really beat up, I mean, those sort of tier 8 tanks when you meet them. So things like the IS-3, even tanks such as the Defender, the VK101P, you know, these are tanks that are generally considered really strong and a pain in the backside to deal with. If you're in the T28 Prototype, assuming they're not dabbing that 2 key, you can deal with them very, very effectively indeed. Even if they are dabbing that 2 key, then you still have superior DPM, and you can try and make them miss or bounce the odd shot here or there, to try and maximise your chances against them. And against those higher tier machines, actually, with the very respectable DPM of this tank, 400 alpha damage is also very respectable, and 248 penetration is very nice indeed. Combine all those things together, and even without dipping into your premium ammunition, and even for such a slow tank, the T28 Prototype, I feel, is actually quite resistant to the matchmaker making it bottom tier and whatnot. You can be a little bit map dependent. The tank does not like a big wide open map, and it does not like artillery in the slightest. But in terms of whether you're top or bottom tier, this tank is pretty uncaring of things like that. I remember playing this tank shortly after they changed the matchmaker, and everyone was whinging and complaining about all these bottom tier games, and I hadn't really noticed. I noticed later on, but I hadn't really noticed at the time because the T28 Prototype really just doesn't care that much. The gun is good enough to keep it competitive regardless of the matchmaking. I mean, there are tier 10s that don't have 248 penetration with their regular rounds, so that is quite a nice feature to have. So I guess the $1,000,000 question, am I keeping the T28 Prototype or selling it? I am probably going to keep it, actually. It's a fun tier 8 tank to play, and in the current setup of the matchmaking, that's not something you can say about all machines. You have enough armour that you can be surprised at the bounces you get. Don't be afraid to heavily angle the front of your tank, especially if you've got a wall or something hiding your side profile. I mean, if you don't have a wall, then don't heavily angle it, because all of that is just easy Pen City. But if you do have a wall, angle the front of your tank. Your gun keeps you competitive. You don't have to fire lots of premium ammunition at people. The only thing you really have to get around is the mobility. And actually, this is a really nice tank to use, and I think I am going to keep it. So, with all that said and done, I hope you guys enjoyed this little tank review of a machine that I don't think gets quite enough love in the game, especially since Wargaming buffed it. I wish you a very happy new year. This is the first tank review of 2018. Hopefully it all goes well for you. Hopefully 2018 treats you well. I hope you enjoyed and found this video informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel, and as ever, I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao ciao.